The narcissist consumes you as the mother, the search for the missing internal object. Most people believe the narcissist wants one thing above all else: attention, admiration, validation. These explanations are not entirely wrong, but they may not reach the deepest layer of the problem. What if admiration is only the surface expression of a much older psychological hunger? What if the narcissist is not merely seeking praise, but unconsciously searching for the first relationship that made human existence feel safe? Within psychoanalytic theory, this possibility leads to a provocative idea. The narcissist does not simply pursue romantic partners or close friends. The narcissist may unconsciously recruit another person to become the symbolic mother. In doing so, they attempt to recover a psychological function that was never securely established during early development. To understand this theory, we must begin with a concept that is unfamiliar to most people. In psychoanalysis, the word object does not refer to a physical thing. It refers to another person as they are represented within the mind. From the moment an infant enters the world, it depends upon caregivers for survival. At first, the infant cannot distinguish itself from the person who feeds, comforts, and regulates its emotional state. The caregiver is not experienced as a separate individual with independent thoughts and desires. Instead, the caregiver becomes part of the infant's earliest psychological world. This insight became central to what is now known as object relations theory. Rather than viewing personality as something that develops in isolation, theorists argued that the human mind is built through relationships. The earliest interactions between infant and caregiver gradually become internal psychological structures. These structures continue to influence emotional life long after childhood has ended. In other words, we do not simply remember our earliest relationships. We carry psychological representations of them within us. Among the most influential figures in this tradition was Donald Winnicott. Winnicott argued that healthy development depends upon what he called the good enough mother. He did not mean a perfect parent. In fact, perfection would interfere with development. A good enough caregiver responds consistently to the child's needs while gradually allowing manageable frustration as the child matures. Through thousands of ordinary interactions, the child slowly learns that safety does not disappear when the caregiver steps away. Emotional stability begins to move from the outside world into the child's own mind. This developmental process is known as internalization. At first, the infant depends entirely upon another person for comfort. Hunger, fear, loneliness, and distress are regulated by the caregiver. Over time, these repeated experiences become part of the child's psychological architecture. The soothing presence of the caregiver is no longer needed every moment because the child has developed an inner capacity for emotional regulation. The external relationship has become an internal structure. The result is what psychoanalytic theorists call an internal object. An internal object is not the actual mother or father. It is the enduring psychological representation of those early relationships. A healthy internal object provides emotional continuity. It allows a person to tolerate disappointment without collapsing. It supports a stable sense of identity during conflict or rejection. Most importantly, it reassures the individual that they remain worthy and psychologically intact even when they are alone. This idea appears in different forms across several schools of psychology. Heinz Kohut emphasized the importance of self-objects, arguing that children require accurate mirroring from caregivers in order to develop a cohesive sense of self. John Bowlby described how early attachment relationships become internal working models that shape expectations throughout life. Margaret Mahler explored the process of separation and individuation, explaining how the child gradually develops a stable identity that exists independently of the caregiver. Although these theorists differed in important respects, they shared a common insight. The self is not born complete. It is built through relationships before it can eventually stand on its own. This brings us to narcissism. Modern psychology recognizes narcissism as a complex phenomenon with biological, developmental, and environmental influences. There is no single theory that explains every case. However, within psychoanalytic models, narcissism is often understood as involving a disturbance in the development of the self. The individual may appear confident, independent, and even superior, yet beneath that appearance, the internal structures responsible for emotional stability remain unusually fragile. What appears to be grandiosity may function as a defense against a much deeper fear of inadequacy or psychological fragmentation. This perspective helps explain why external validation becomes so powerful. Praise does more than inflate the ego. It temporarily reinforces an unstable sense of self. Admiration does more than produce pleasure. It briefly reduces insecurity. Attention does more than satisfy vanity. It helps organize an internal world that struggles to remain coherent without continual reinforcement. From this point of view, narcissistic supply is not simply about feeling important. It performs a psychological function that healthy internal structures would ordinarily provide. Sam Vaknin expands upon this idea through his concept of the false self. According to Vaknin, the narcissist constructs an elaborate psychological identity designed to protect against unbearable feelings of shame, emptiness, and dependency. The false self becomes a public performance that demands continual confirmation from the outside world. It cannot sustain itself through internal stability because its foundations remain fragile. As a result, relationships become essential. Other people are recruited to maintain an identity that cannot reliably maintain itself. Here we arrive at the central thesis of this essay. If the narcissist depends upon external people to perform functions that were never securely internalized, then relationships become something far more significant than companionship. The partner is no longer experienced simply as another adult with independent needs and desires. The partner is unconsciously assigned a psychological role. They become the source of reassurance, regulation, validation, and emotional containment. In symbolic terms, they become the mother once again. This is not the literal mother of childhood. It is the psychological function the mother originally performed. The partner becomes the person who reflects worth, calms emotional chaos, protects against shame, and reassures the narcissist that the self remains intact. From within this psychoanalytic framework, the relationship begins to resemble an attempt to recover something that was never fully established during development. The narcissist is not only searching for love, the narcissist is searching for the missing internal object. Part 2. Why does the narcissist consumes the mother? If this psychoanalytic model is correct, then narcissistic relationships must be understood differently than they are in everyday conversation. Most discussions focus on manipulation, attention-seeking, or a desire for control. These behaviors are certainly important, but object relations theory asks a deeper question. What psychological function do these behaviors serve? Why does the narcissist seem unable to sustain a relationship without turning it into a struggle over attention, validation, and emotional dependence? Within this framework, the answer is surprisingly simple. The narcissist is not merely trying to receive affection. The narcissist is unconsciously attempting to recover a missing psychological structure. The relationship is expected to accomplish something far greater than intimacy. It is expected to stabilize the self. This is why the title of this essay uses the word consume. Consumption is not simply taking from another person. It is the attempt to absorb something into oneself. We consume food because the body transforms it into part of itself. In the same symbolic sense, the narcissist attempts to consume another person's psychological functions. The unconscious hope is that enough admiration, enough reassurance, enough emotional regulation, and enough devotion will finally become permanent. The partner is not simply appreciated. The partner is psychologically recruited to become part of the narcissist's internal world. This helps explain why the beginning of narcissistic relationships often feels unusually intense. The idealization phase is not simply romantic excitement. Within psychoanalytic theory, it reflects the discovery of someone who appears capable of performing the emotional functions that are desperately needed. The new partner seems uniquely compassionate, uniquely understanding, and uniquely accepting. Ordinary attraction quickly becomes extraordinary significance because the partner is no longer experienced only as a romantic interest. They become the symbolic solution to an internal problem. This is why many people describe the beginning of these relationships as feeling almost magical. The narcissist appears completely fascinated. They seem deeply attentive. They study every detail about the other person. They often describe the relationship as destiny or claim they have finally found someone who truly understands them. While these experiences may feel deeply genuine in the moment, psychoanalytic theory suggests they are driven by unconscious psychological needs rather than mature intimacy alone. The partner gradually becomes the symbolic mother. This statement is easily misunderstood unless we remember that the mother represents a psychological function rather than a literal person. The mother is the first regulator of emotion. She is the first mirror through which the child discovers a sense of identity. She comforts distress before the child can comfort itself. She organizes experience before the child possesses the mental structures to organize it alone. These functions gradually become internal during healthy development. When that process remains incomplete, the individual may continue searching for someone who can perform them from the outside. Viewed through this lens, many familiar narcissistic behaviors begin to take on a different meaning. The constant need for reassurance is not merely insecurity, it reflects dependence upon external regulation. The demand for admiration is not simply vanity. It reinforces an unstable identity. The expectation that another person will always be emotionally available is not merely selfishness. It reflects an unconscious belief that psychological stability depends upon the continual presence of another human being. This also helps explain why boundaries often create such intense reactions. Healthy adults recognize that every relationship contains limits. Each person has independent needs, responsibilities, and emotional experiences. The narcissistic personality may struggle to accept these limits because they interfere with the psychological role assigned to the partner. A partner who establishes boundaries is no longer functioning as the endlessly available regulator the unconscious mind expects. The experience is not simply disappointing, it may feel psychologically destabilizing. Otto Kernberg argued that pathological narcissism involves difficulties integrating positive and negative representations of both self and others. Instead of holding a balanced view in which another person can be loving while also imperfect, the individual may swing between idealization and devaluation. During idealization, the partner is experienced as almost entirely good because they successfully perform the desired psychological function. During devaluation, the same partner becomes experienced as disappointing, rejecting, or even hostile once that function can no longer be maintained. This dramatic shift often confuses the partner. They wonder how someone who once expressed overwhelming affection can suddenly become distant, critical, or emotionally cold. Object relations theory suggests that the change may not originate in the partner's behavior alone. It reflects the collapse of the unconscious fantasy that another person could permanently stabilize the self. The partner has not necessarily changed. The psychological role assigned to the partner has become impossible to sustain. This is the paradox at the heart of narcissism. The narcissist desperately needs another person, yet simultaneously fears needing anyone at all. Dependency threatens the image of superiority created by the false self. Every moment of genuine emotional need risks exposing vulnerability. As a result, the very person who provides comfort also becomes a reminder of weakness. Gratitude becomes difficult because gratitude acknowledges dependence. Love becomes complicated because love requires mutual recognition. The partner is needed, yet the fact that they are needed produces shame. The narcissist, therefore, attempts to solve an impossible problem. They seek complete emotional dependence without feeling dependent. They want unconditional acceptance while remaining psychologically invulnerable. They desire limitless reassurance without acknowledging the depth of their need. No relationship can satisfy these contradictory demands. Every partner eventually demonstrates independence. Every human being has limits. Every relationship contains frustration. The symbolic mother inevitably becomes an ordinary person once again. At this point, the unconscious project begins to fail. The narcissist discovers that the partner cannot permanently become the missing internal object. No amount of love can erase the developmental work that was never completed. No amount of reassurance can permanently replace internal emotional regulation. No amount of admiration can construct a stable identity from the outside. The external relationship reaches its natural limits, and those limits expose the original psychological wound. This is why the word consume becomes so significant. The narcissist is not simply trying to possess another person. The deeper unconscious wish is to absorb the psychological functions that person provides. Yet human beings cannot be internalized through possession. They remain separate minds with independent thoughts, feelings, and boundaries. The narcissist therefore confronts an impossible task. They attempt to transform another person into an internal structure, but another person can never become part of the mind in the way early development required. The tragedy is not simply that the relationship fails. The tragedy is that the unconscious search continues. Another relationship appears to promise another solution. Another idealized partner appears capable of becoming the perfect regulator, the perfect mirror, and the perfect source of emotional stability. Yet the underlying developmental problem remains unchanged because it cannot ultimately be solved through the repeated acquisition of new relationships. The search continues, not because the right partner has not yet been found, but because no partner can permanently become the missing internal object. Part 3. Why the search never ends. Conclusion of our talk. If the partner cannot become the missing internal object, an important question remains. Why does the narcissist continue repeating the same pattern? Why do so many relationships begin with extraordinary intensity only to end in disappointment, conflict, or emotional collapse? Within the psychoanalytic tradition, repetition is not viewed as random behavior. It is understood as an unconscious attempt to master an unresolved developmental conflict. The mind returns to the same emotional landscape because it continues searching for a different ending. This idea appears throughout psychoanalytic thought. Sigmund Freud described what he called the repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate unresolved emotional experiences rather than leave them behind. Later theorists expanded this idea by arguing that people unconsciously recreate familiar relationship patterns because those patterns feel psychologically meaningful, even when they produce suffering. The narcissistic relationship can be understood in much the same way. Each new partner appears to offer another opportunity to complete a developmental process that never fully reached completion. At the beginning of every relationship, hope is renewed. The narcissist often experiences an overwhelming sense of possibility because the new partner has not yet challenged the unconscious fantasy. They appear endlessly available. They seem emotionally attuned. They respond with admiration, curiosity, and affection. For a brief period, the external relationship appears capable of providing the stability that the internal world cannot consistently maintain. The partner experiences something very different. They often feel deeply valued and unusually understood. The narcissist appears fascinated by every detail of their personality. Conversations continue for hours. Emotional intimacy develops rapidly. The relationship seems to accelerate beyond ordinary expectations. Many survivors later describe this stage as feeling unlike anything they had ever experienced before. They believe they have finally met someone capable of extraordinary love. From the psychoanalytic perspective developed throughout this essay, something more complicated is taking place. The narcissist is not simply falling in love with another human being. The narcissist is unconsciously assigning that person a psychological function. The partner becomes the regulator of emotional stability, the mirror of identity, and the symbolic mother who appears capable of repairing an internal absence that has existed since early development. No human being can permanently sustain that role. Every healthy relationship eventually requires differentiation. Each partner maintains independent thoughts, independent emotions, and independent needs. Real intimacy depends upon recognizing that two separate people can remain connected without becoming psychologically fused. This developmental achievement begins during childhood and continues throughout adult life. Margaret Mahler described this process as separation and individuation. Mature love depends upon preserving both intimacy and separateness at the same time. For the narcissistic personality, separateness may become profoundly threatening. The partner's independence interrupts the unconscious fantasy that another person can permanently regulate the self. A delayed text message becomes more than an inconvenience. Disagreement becomes more than a difference of opinion. Emotional distance becomes more than an ordinary fluctuation within the relationship. Each experience may be interpreted as evidence that the psychological foundation itself is beginning to disappear. This helps explain why apparently minor events sometimes provoke remarkably intense reactions. The emotional response is not necessarily proportional to the event itself. Instead, the event activates a much older psychological fear. If the symbolic mother withdraws, who now performs the functions that have remained external rather than internal, the anxiety is not only about losing the relationship. Within this psychoanalytic model, it is about losing the structure that temporarily held the self together. The partner often responds by trying harder. They reassure more frequently. They explain themselves repeatedly. They become increasingly patient in the hope that understanding will restore the relationship. Ironically, these efforts may strengthen the unhealthy dynamic because they reinforce the very psychological dependence that lies beneath it. The more completely the partner assumes responsibility for regulating the narcissist's emotional life, the more essential that role becomes. Eventually, exhaustion begins to replace intimacy. The partner discovers that reassurance has no lasting effect. Yesterday's validation no longer satisfies today's insecurity. Yesterday's admiration no longer prevents tomorrow's crisis. The emotional demands continue because the underlying problem has never been resolved. External reassurance can temporarily stabilize the system, but it cannot permanently construct the internal psychological structures that healthy development normally provides. This observation brings us back to Sam Vaknin's concept of the false self. Vaknin argues that the narcissist constructs an identity designed to defend against profound feelings of inadequacy and emptiness. The false self appears grandiose, independent, and emotionally invulnerable. Yet maintaining this identity requires continual support from the external world. The contradiction becomes impossible to escape. The individual appears self-sufficient while remaining deeply dependent upon the reactions of other people. Seen through this lens, narcissistic supply becomes easier to understand. Supply is not valuable merely because it feels pleasurable. It becomes psychologically necessary because it temporarily reinforces a fragile internal structure. Admiration, attention, status, and recognition all serve the same underlying purpose. They help maintain an identity that cannot consistently maintain itself from within. When the supply diminishes, the false self becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, and the search for a new source of regulation begins again. It is important to recognize that this remains one theoretical framework among several. Contemporary research on narcissism includes cognitive, behavioral, developmental, genetic, and neuroscientific perspectives. No single theory explains every individual, and not every clinician agrees with the assumptions of object relations theory. Even so, the psychoanalytic model continues to offer a powerful way of understanding why certain narcissistic relationships feel less like partnerships and more like emotional systems organized around regulation, dependency, and repeated cycles of idealization and disappointment. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not what happens to the narcissist. It is what happens to the person who unknowingly accepts the role of the symbolic mother. They enter the relationship expecting reciprocity. Instead, they gradually become responsible for maintaining another person's emotional equilibrium. Their worth becomes measured by how effectively they soothe distress, prevent shame, provide reassurance, and restore psychological stability. Over time, they may lose sight of their own emotional needs because so much energy is directed toward preserving someone else's internal world. Healthy love cannot survive under those conditions. Love requires two people who recognize one another as separate individuals with equal dignity and equal psychological reality. It cannot flourish when one person unconsciously becomes an emotional life support system for the other. Intimacy depends upon mutual recognition, not psychological consumption. This returns us to the central idea of the essay. The phrase, "the narcissist consumes you as the mother," is not meant literally. It describes an unconscious psychological process proposed within object relations theory. The partner is recruited to perform maternal functions that should gradually have become internal during healthy development. They become the mirror that reflects worth, the regulator that calms distress, and the emotional container that protects against fragmentation. The narcissist attempts to absorb these functions into the self, hoping they will finally become permanent. Yet no external person can complete that task. An internal object cannot be permanently built through possession, dependency, admiration, or emotional fusion. It develops through early attachment, gradual internalization, and the lifelong integration of the self. When those foundations remain unstable, the search may continue across relationship after relationship, each one carrying the unconscious hope that this time the missing structure will finally be found. In the end, the narcissist is not only searching for another person. Within this psychoanalytic framework, the narcissist is searching for the internal mother who was never securely established within the architecture of the self. Every new relationship appears to promise that missing foundation. Every disappointment reveals that another human being cannot permanently become an internal psychological structure. The search continues because the hunger is directed towards something no partner can ever truly provide.